And do please tag at CPRE if you're tweeting, or hashtag Brownfield first. So shall we ask Rose?
It was soon snuffed
Get
out.
us
The
started.
difference has been felt ever since.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rose Grayston, and I lead the New Economics Foundation's housing programme, generating new ideas on how to deliver decent, secure, genuinely affordable homes for all without wrecking the planet in the process. I also co-authored the recent report of the Create Streets Foundation's No Place Left Behind Commission with Toby Lloyd, which we were hopeful will get a hearing from government on ideas to re-gear funding and policy towards regeneration of existing places, including left behind places with lower housing demand. This means moving beyond the over-reliance we've seen in recent years on rural and suburban sprawl to achieve additionality targets. Understanding the current availability, use and planning status of brownfield land in different places is crucial to moving this agenda forward. So I'm delighted to be speaking to you today at the launch of CPRE, the Countryside Charity's latest State of Brownfield research. The good news is there is an enormous amount of previously developed land spread across the country, which we could use to provide homes, business premises, and a range of social and community infrastructure to support places to bounce back from the ravages of the pandemic. The bad news is we don't yet have the right mix of responsibilities, policies, and funding mechanisms to shepherd investment into existing places and avoid incentivising unnecessary sprawl. The No Place Left Behind Commission's final report includes a veritable cornucopia of ideas to support the shift we need to see, and I'm thrilled to see the report mentioned in CPRE's new research today. Some of the ideas which most directly speak to that report include: firstly, Homes England must be empowered with a new mission-based remit to focus on retrofitting, quality, regeneration, and long-term placemaking, with new funding streams to support this. Many brownfield sites in left-behind towns require costly remediation works as a result of contamination, which is often a legacy of these places' industrial histories. Cleaning these sites up so they are safe and ready to make a contribution to the economic, social, and environmental life of these places is a crucial foundation stone of levelling up. We also recommend the government extends its proposed right to regenerate to private land as well as public land, empowering communities and local authorities to acquire empty property at fair value, backed up by reforms to compulsory purchase compensation rules. This would disincentivise private and public landowners from leaving brownfield sites unused and would provide a way forward for alternative plans to make use of such sites where they do exist. Thirdly, government must take action to equalise VAT work to repair, maintain and adapt existing homes with VAT for new build, finally bringing to an end the absurd situation where you pay full VAT to make an old cold home fit for the future, but no VAT at all to tear that home down and build a new one. The environmental implications of that are pretty staggering. Constructing a two-bedroom house uses up the equivalent of 80 tonnes of CO2, a staggering 10 times the CO2 produced by refurbishing a two-bedroom home. And to leverage the full benefits of retrofitting homes for levelling up and for addressing the climate emergency, we cannot rely on a patchwork home-by-home approach. We need area-based programmes to retrofit homes block by block, street by street, neighbourhood by neighbourhood. No Place Left Behind spoke to community-led regeneration projects in neighbourhoods where two-bedroom homes regularly sell for as little as £15,000, not only in the regions of England where average property prices are lowest, like the North East, but also in deprived pockets of regions with above average house prices. Making retrofitting investment in these places stack up means place-level investment to overcome such falsely depressed property values. With my New Economics Foundation hat on, Next Great Homes Upgrade campaign is lobbying for the funding needed to make ambitious area-based retrofitting a reality, from setting up a national retrofit task force to combine funding for home insulation and low carbon heating. Clearly, if we make better use of the homes we've already got, that will put far less pressure on greenfield sites on the outskirts of existing towns and cities. Finally, if we think about why some neighbourhoods have undergone a decline in the quality of their built and natural environments in recent years, one thing that stood out to us in the No Place Left Behind Commission as unhelpful was the way government policy has redirected first-time buyer demand away from existing neighbourhoods. Prior to the introduction of the Help to Buy equity loan in 2013, first-time buyers making their first steps onto the housing ladder provided an important source of demand for more affordable properties in more affordable neighbourhoods, which many of them then went on to improve. Much of this demand and the aspirational young families that came with it has since been redirected into new build housing subsidised by Help to Buy. which in turn has incentivised the development of less dense housing on the peripheries of existing settlements. The regional price caps introduced for Help to Buy purchases in April 2021 are likely to reinforce this pattern. With the price cap for the North East set at just £186,000, it is difficult to see how the scheme can avoid directing new development towards peripheral greenfield sites capable of delivering new build homes at lower values, rather than the regenerative development in existing neighbourhoods that so-called left behind places need. Thank you to CPRE for inviting me today and for helping us to better understand the extent of the opportunity of brownfield land in this country.
Wonderful. So you need to unmute. I have. Rose, thank you so much. That was a great start, a huge amount for us to think about. Can we go straight to Ruth Cadbury, who is Shadow Planning Minister. Ruth, thank you very, very much. And I look forward to hearing what you've got to.
Thank you very much for inviting me today, and also congratulations on this very timely report, and very comprehensive report into the state of brownfield development in 2021. And I know such a lot of work's gone into the report, and also must have involved many hours spent looking at spreadsheets. Obviously, I think we all agree we're living in a housing crisis, and specifically one based on affordability. We need truly affordable homes where people want to live, accessible to where they'll be working, and these homes need to come alongside adequate community and concrete infrastructure, schools, parks, GPs, transport, and so on. They need to be built with a climate crisis and net zero at their core, and 1 million new homes have been built since this government, the Conservative government, passed Labour's zero carbon homes policy. So we've got to retrofit all those homes, plus all the ones built in decades prior to that. And equally, plans for new developments need to ensure that local communities still have a voice in the planning system, and I'm pleased to see that aspect in the report, and something that CPRE have always championed and supported. So, brownfield development, and first of all, this is in the context of the challenges facing local councils and planning departments anyway. The first is around the expertise and the unique skills required for brownfield regeneration, especially on former industrial sites or ones with industrial waste and debris. And I think a report in 2018 found that only 39% of local authorities have a specialised officer who works on regeneration of difficult sites such as these. And this comes, of course, in the context of the wider skills challenge facing local authority town planners, overall shortage of staff. And our TPI told me this morning that one council has a total of 5 staff for all planning functions, including local plan, applications, and enforcement. So there's a real challenge. Another challenge, one mentioned in this report, is around compulsory purchase powers. And our Shadow Housing Minister, Lucy Powell, put forward an ambitious policy at Labour's conference, where we would beef up the powers given to local authorities to use CPO powers to ensure that they can build on brownfield land and do it more easily. And our proposed reform also seeks to challenge the high cost of land by reforming arcane compensation rules, and was hailed by the Deputy Mayor of London's Deputy Mayor of Housing as a game changer, something that's really needed. Also pleased that CPRE have mentioned the detrimental impact that the government's reforms on permitted development rights are having. PDR changes not only leave communities and councils as bystanders in planning decisions, but as we've already seen, lead to poor quality homes in inappropriate locations. And the latest changes will impact on the viability of too many town and village centres. This report is really important. It's shown how many homes have planning permission but are yet unbuilt, hardly the fault of the planning system then, which the previous Secretary of State was so keen to rip up, and we're still waiting to see what the new Secretary of State feels about the planning system. The report shows that brownfield land released for housing development has decreased by 38%, but the use of greenfield land has increased by 148% in the same period. We cannot lose what is a precious resource in the habitable parts of the UK when there is brownfield land waiting to be developed and available to be developed. The report also highlights that in some of the brownfield funding provided by government that's been previously released, such as the Brownfield Land Release Fund, we've been seeing the majority of the funding going not only to the south, but also to the most affluent boroughs and districts in the country. And that is, again, that is completely the opposite of the intentions of levelling up. If I have some sense of what levelling up means, although that has yet to be defined. So just in conclusion, really welcome this report and really look forward to working with CPRE in the future. Thank you.
Ruth, thank you so much. Again, much to think about. Now, please, Paul Miner, will you tell us some more from the CPRE about this policy?
Thanks very much, Emma, and good morning, everyone. So just by way of background, we've had, in national planning policy, we don't currently have a brownfield first approach. We did in the 1990s under John Gummer and then John Prescott. But since the NPPF came into force in 2012, there's no explicit policy. However, since 2014, the government has introduced brownfield land registers, which we think is a very welcome development because it makes it clear and public how much brownfield land is available through the planning system. And what we've been seeing consistently year on year as local authorities have been getting more used to brownfield land registers, that more and more land is being identified, and we're beginning to see where that is and what the potential of it for new housing is. And consistent with that, our latest State of Brownfield 2021 report has looked at all the brownfield land registers that have been updated up until this year. And we found that there's an increase in the amount of brownfield land available for development. We already have over 1 million sites identified on registers, and in the past year, this has increased by a further 100,000, a further 10% increase in the amount of brownfield land that's suitable and available for new housing development. But more concerningly, what we're also seeing is that this land is taking longer to get through the system. So only less than half of these identified brownfield sites have planning permission, which is or 44%. And this is a decrease of 9% from what was identified in brownfield land registers in 2020. It's also important to remember that with the land that's been identified, that there's a fair spread of it across the country, but with a substantial amount in London, but also 375,000 houses have been identified on sites in the Midlands and in the northern region, so the northwest, northeast, and Yorkshire and the Humber. But it's also particularly salutary to note with these areas that a lower proportion in the northern regions has planning permission than in the southern regions. So again, there's a particular issue about this land being stuck and local councils not being able to do enough to bring it forward. And that links to the point that Ruth made about that lack of resources in local councils to be able to bring these sites forward. But also, as well as the resourcing issue, there's also particular concerns about the effects of government planning policy since the NPPF came into force. And the government wants to boost the supply of housing, build 300,000 houses a year. But what we've been seeing consistently since the mid-2000s under both Labour and Conservative governments is that housing completions have hovered well below that at consistently only about 140,000 houses a year. And even though we're not building really much more housing than we ever have been, more and more of this housing is taking place on greenfield sites. So there's been a substantial increase with over nearly 150% in the amount of greenfield land being released on average every year for housing development. Whereas the amount of brownfield land that's being released has generally stayed flat. So, but we're still not building any more new housing than we were when we had the brownfield first policy in the mid-2000s. So what does CPRE want to see done about this? Well, we think that given the consistent consistent amount of brownfield that's coming forward through the system, and the amount of brownfield potential that still needs to be encouraged to be brought forward, we need stronger planning policies insisting that brownfield sites should be developed before greenfield as a matter of policy. And also to support that, we need local councils to work together so that particular areas of large towns and cities where there is a particular concentration of brownfield land are prioritised for development, so that more rural areas aren't expected to plan for large increases in housing development on competing greenfield sites instead. So we need a more strategic county or city-wide approach to planning to make sure this brownfield potential comes forward and we're not releasing greenfield unnecessarily. But that needs to be addressed in the government's review of the National Planning Policy Framework that we expect in the new year. Boris Johnson said some very encouraging things about not releasing greenfield unnecessarily and focusing on brownfield, but that the rhetoric needs to be backed up with hard policies, and I look forward to hearing more from Minister Christopher Pincher about the government's plans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Paul. And now, without more ado, we go to Chris Pincher, please, the Housing Minister. We are so thrilled to have you with us. Thank you for coming, Chris. We're very pleased about the general direction of travel regarding planning at the moment, and extremely excited to hear what you've got to share with us. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Emma, and also to the other contributors that we've just heard, who I think have raised some very useful, insightful and pertinent points. Can I begin by adding to the bouquets under which the CPRE is being buried today in thanking you for bringing us together to discuss this really important topic, how we can better protect and preserve our countryside, and how we can focus more effectively and more precisely on delivering the homes that the country needs on the brownfield sites that the country has. Because making the best use of brownfield is at the heart of what the government is trying to achieve in delivering those new homes. The Prime Minister has said it, the Secretary of State, new Secretary of State has said it. He's already met with a number of key stakeholders to express this point, that we need to make full use of our brownfield sites, because often they're in the most sustainable locations. They're near to infrastructure, to transport hubs, to the places where people need to be. So I particularly welcome the CPRE's focus on brownfield, and I'm really pleased to see yet another insightful annual state of brownfield report. I think it confirms what we already know and believe, which is that there is a rich seam of regeneratable land right across our country that we can and must make better use of. The NPPF, despite what Paul has said, and I'll come back to some of Paul's other comments in a moment, I think does encourage focus on brownfield sites, especially when it comes to providing new homes near to our high streets and our town centres in our inner cities. And as concrete examples, if you'll forgive the pun, of our determination to focus on brownfield, when we looked at local housing need last year, we uplifted the local housing need targets in our 20 largest cities by 35%. And that's because those places tend to be near to infrastructure, schools, GP practices, playgrounds and the like. So it enables us to maximise the existing infrastructure that we have in and around our country. Now, obviously, some brownfield sites are more challenging than other sorts of sites to deliver. Often councils require other additional support to maximise their use. We recognise that, and we want to support councils and mayoral combined authorities in doing that. That is why we last year allocated £400 million in the Brownfield Regeneration Fund, which went largely to places, contrary to what Ruth may have suggested earlier on, largely to places in the North and the Midlands. The West Midlands Combined Authority received over £100 million of that fund. Manchester, Greater Manchester, received nearly £90 million of monies to unlock brownfield sites. Last month, we allocated a further £58 million to something like 53 councils around the country, so they can transform smaller brownfield sites into residential accommodation near to the infrastructure that people need to use, near to the places where they need to live and work. And there's more of that on the way. It's also worth saying that there are major regeneration opportunities going on and growing in our Northern and Midlands centres. I went to Longbridge just last week and saw for myself what's being done on the old MG Mini factory, which is 5 football pitches in length. It's almost as wide as well. And as well as commercial opportunities and retail opportunities, which will be put there to generate jobs, thousands of new homes will also be developed. Paul mentioned brownfield lists that councils are obliged to keep. I think more can be done in that arena. I hear anecdotally that the brownfield registers can sometimes be inconsistent, that some authorities are more, shall we say, muscular than others in approaching the market and trying to identify the maximum number of brownfield sites that can come forward for allocation. I think we can do more with local authorities and MCAs to advance brownfield land registers. But another key component of the Recycling Our Land report is the importance of developers agreeing design standards. I think that's very important because experience tells us that good design, beautiful design, if you will, is one which is very sensitive to local concerns. It can be one of the big issues that local communities have when new development is to take place close to them. It's one of the reasons why the revised NPPF has placed much greater emphasis on beauty and placemaking. It's why we're rolling out the National Model Design Code. Currently 14 local authorities are helping us pilot it, and I hope that we can do more shortly, and why we're introducing the Office for Place to support local authorities in developing good localized design codes, with the objective of local authorities having their own officer for place in the future. The CPRE analysis identifies something like an additional 1.3 million homes that can be unlocked on brownfield sites. And I think that does show that there is still some further untapped potential. If I look specifically at an area close to me, the West Midlands, I know Andy Street has commissioned a report on brownfield opportunities in his mayoral combined authority area. I think the report will be published quite soon. I look forward to seeing that in combination with what the CPRE have produced to demonstrate at a more localized level what sort of additional brownfield opportunities there may be. We do intend to go further and faster over the coming months to unlock those sorts of brownfield sites, working in partnership with local authorities and other stakeholders, such as the CPRE and others on this call. It's one of the reasons why at the SR and budget just a few weeks ago, the Chancellor announced a further £1.8 billion to regenerate communities and level up the country. 300 million of that will be focused on mayoral combined authorities. And we think in total that will unlock something like 160,000 new homes on derelict and unused land. So there are lots of opportunities, I think, that we can together work on to deliver the sorts of homes that we want in our country, in the places that we need them, to the design standards and to the environmental quality that generations now and in the future expect. So I'm grateful to you for this report, and I trust that we will have a rich and fruitful conversation over the next several minutes, and over the next several weeks, months and years, we together work to make sure that those houses, those homes of the future, are built on brownfield sites.
Thank you very, very much. A lot of really exciting and positive news. I'm going to read out some questions now. It's great. We've got lots of questions coming in. I'll give you a bunch of three at a time. From Kate Lamack at CPRE's Policy Committee, using brownfield sites beneficially for residents must go hand in hand with efficient quality public transport. This is a requirement of which government remains oblivious. How can we make sure that the linkage between housing and provision of public transport is adopted as national policy? Second question from Zafir Lovell from the National Residents Association. I would be interested to know CPRE's view on the value of neighbourhood plans. Third question from Andy Ewell from Lancaster University. Can and should government empower local communities, especially in left behind places, to drive their own regeneration and level up from the bottom up through more targeted support for neighbourhood planning in urban and deprived areas and greater recognition of wider placemaking role of neighbourhood planning? Can we come back to you, Chris, first to tackle any or all of those questions, please?
Yes, of course. Well, on neighbourhood plans, I think there were two questions on them. I am very much in favour of them. And I think as we refine and prepare to publish our response to the consultation on our planning reform proposals last year, we want to make sure that neighbourhood plans form a part of that response for a number of reasons. One is that they are particularly engaging. We all know that there are challenges with community engagement in local plan making, but when it comes to neighbourhood plans, more people tend to become involved, and that's a very good thing, and I think we need to harness that. I think neighbourhood plans can also be very good for identifying good additional places for homes in the right places. They can also contribute toward design, coding, and that sort of beautiful planning. But we don't have enough of them. They tend to be in more rural places, and they tend to be, this is a little bit of a crude yardstick, they tend to be in the south rather than the Midlands and the north. So what we need to do is to find ways of getting them into more urban, more Midlands and northern places as well, so communities there can benefit from them, and that's something which we'll be working toward. With respect to, I think it was Kate's question on making sure that new development has the appropriate infrastructure to support it, and I think particularly she mentioned transport. Well, I think Grant Shapps is making an announcement today on the integrated transport review, so it's very apposite that Kate should raise that point today, but there will, I think, be a clear message that we need to use good transport planning as well to not just underpin unlocking of homes in the right places, but support those homes as they are built out. I think Homes England can, with DFT and Highways England and such organisations, play an important part in master planning and bringing together those opportunities to make sure that the right infrastructure is supported. But I make one last point, and that is, if we are building homes in the right places, such as on brownfield sites in urban communities, oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes the infrastructure is already there and doesn't need to be built from scratch. It can simply be augmented to deliver the sorts of home support that we require.
Any thoughts on that sort of specific question about transport linkage to the to development of housing?
So was that a question to me?
Yes.
Yeah, well, yes, I think it is absolutely essential that, you know, if we are going to develop new homes, particularly in more complex places, you've got to think about the transport infrastructure. And that's what, as I say, we can do through the offices of Homes England, working with local authorities, and certainly mayoral combined authorities, I think, can play a role in that, notwithstanding the fact that different mayoral authorities have different responsibilities around transport. And I think it's something that we need to work closely across government departments to achieve. So working with DFT and their integrated transport review to make sure that those sorts of considerations are properly played out when we are thinking about developing new homes.
Thank
As
you.
part of the planning regime.
Thank you. Okay, Rose, would you like to answer all or any of those questions?
Yeah, so thinking about transport in particular, I think it's important to understand that what we need to do here to actually make use of the brownfield sites in northern regions, particularly in neighbourhoods where you've got pretty low housing demand, what we're talking about requires a pretty major shift in the role and funding of Homes England, away from thinking, or at least beyond thinking about additionality in determining how to allocate and evaluate funding, and instead the state via Homes England and devolved government becoming a market maker in many left behind places, because you simply don't have the value in land and housing in a lot of left behind neighbourhoods that would support government to invest in high quality public transport in these places, let alone in brownfield land remediation. That is what is required. I'd also add that we need to move beyond thinking about the big ticket transport infrastructure that we're going to hear a lot about today, as important as it is to think about train connectivity between major cities. What's really going to turn things around in a lot of left behind neighbourhoods where I would describe house and land values as being falsely depressed. You know, for homes to be selling, for a 2-bedroom house to be selling for £15,000 in places in the northeast, for places like Great Yarmouth to include streets where homes sell for as little as £16,000 in 2021. Those are falsely depressed values which result from low public transport, low quality public amenity, poor placemaking in the surrounding area, and investing in a place rather than just in individual homes and individual streets can overcome those falsely depressed values. So I'd point to trams and the advances that have been made recently in bringing down the cost of trams. I'd point also to buses. In a lot of left behind places, car ownership is pretty low, but you don't have the level of demand that would be needed to support trains as the primary solution to public transport concerns. So CPRE has done some really great thinking on buses and some work to calculate the costs of providing a bus route through every community in this country. The costs are not that high. That is probably the best option for improving connectivity in communities across this country, rather than over-focusing on the links between major cities, as important as that is. So if we really want to make the most of brownfield sites at a neighbourhood level, if we don't want to be restricted only to those great brownfield sites around existing train stations and around existing big ticket transport infrastructure, then I think we need to be thinking about a broader range of public transport in the mix. Neighbourhood planning, I think, is clearly a really important part of how you make this happen. Reflecting on the mention of permitted development rights in the report and the concerns that a lot of people have, that permitted development rights have led to lower quality housing than what would be produced through conversions of offices and other buildings to dwellings through the planning system. Thinking about that, thinking about one of our case studies from No Place Left Behind, local Chatham Arches, a local trust big lottery project, they found that their neighbourhood plan started getting their community engaged in explaining why permitted development was harmful, whereas previously there had been really no tools for that community to push back against mass conversion of commercial property to really low quality housing, which ended up being used by more prosperous nearby communities as a way of displacing homeless and low income households onto a deprived community, which of course made it even more difficult for that community to raise itself up. So I definitely think there's a crucial role for neighbourhood planning in transforming neighbourhoods, rather than just let's take this one individual brownfield site and try to bung some houses on it. That is not going to work where we have this problem of falsely depressed values.
Rose, thank you very, very much. That's very clearly put. Could we hear from Paul on some of these questions?
Thanks very much, Emma. I agree with a lot of what's been said on these questions already. I think the only points that I would add are that very, very strongly agree with the Minister that we need to support neighbourhood planning more. I think there's a number of ways we need to think of doing that. In particular, I think neighbourhood plans need more policy backing through the National Planning Policy Framework, so that they can't be undermined by land speculators and big developers in the way that they perhaps can be at the moment. I think if we have that stronger policy support, I think that will be a great incentive for communities to get involved more. And yeah, I agree very strongly with what Rose said about permitted development. I think again, if local communities are given the power to be able to cancel permitted development rights that don't work for their vision for their future. So if they want to get particular uses of land in a town centre, or they want to use town centre buildings for a particular purpose, they don't just want to see all those buildings converted into flats, then again, I think that will be a very important incentive, and I hope the department will look more closely at that. So, and again, on transport, I agree with what's been said as well. Brownfield sites are particularly valuable in terms of tackling the climate emergency, because brownfield sites in urban areas, people have got more choices of how they get around. They can walk or cycle to the shops or to facilities, whereas a lot of greenfield developments we've seen in recent years have often been very car dependent, and as a result of that, it led to increasing levels of pollution in the surrounding area, which is an increasing problem in a lot of rural areas, and is making it more difficult for local authorities in many rural areas to build more housing. So a brownfield first policy will have a number of benefits in that regard.
Thanks, Paul. Ruth, would you like to come in on any of those?
Well, just very briefly, I mean, I agree with what a lot of both Rose and Paul have already said. And I mean, call me old-fashioned, but planning is not just about delivering housing numbers. It's about the all-encompassing how different parts of the of land use interrelate with each other. It's national, it's regional, it's local, and the power of a proper planning system has been very badly undermined, particularly in the last 10 years, and the only people that seem to have the upper hand are the volume house builders that have got away with building not communities on that whole, but just very dense developments of flats or little houses with gardens in the middle of nowhere with few, if any, local services. I mean, I noticed that Chris didn't commit strongly to a preference for brownfield first, which I think we really should be doing, because yes, it's more complex, but it also probably generally makes better use of our land and is in the context of existing urban layout. The only I would make is the one that Roger Geffin from Cycling UK made in the chat, is that and I've seen an example of this in Northeast Derbyshire. Some brownfield sites are, say, ex-mining sites in the middle of not near a community centre. And I saw one that was developed by Homes England, because there were no land costs, but the value was ploughed back into the decontamination and turning the open space into good quality natural environments. That was good, but the community that was built there wasn't a community; it was a bunch of houses. And for anybody to get anywhere in and out, to get to school, college, work, shopping, etc., you need to have a car. And so, we have to both design places that make common sense in terms of the interrelationship of different uses, and public transport has to be at the core. And for most of the country, that means buses, and the bus network has effectively been decimated as the subsidies have been removed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, very, very much. Now, let's have a look. We've got a lot of questions coming in, and I'd ask everyone to be as precise and concise as possible now, so we can get through as many questions as possible. Here's one from Rob Lennox, Senior Advocacy Coordinator at the Chartered Institute of Archaeologists, a great deal of brownfield land has both archaeological and ecological significance. Impact on these sites must be mitigated to ensure sustainable development. Can panelists confirm that they will not support approaches which sidestep appropriate evaluations and mitigation for our cultural and national heritage on brownfield sites? The RSPB and the Heritage Alliance are also very keen to hear a response to this question in particular. A question from Patricia Broadfoot, Chair of CPRE in Gloucestershire and a CPRE National Trustee. Would it be possible for the government to provide a help to buy scheme for properties on brownfield sites? And a question from Debbie McConnell from CPRE Lancashire, who wants to particularly ask the Housing Minister, the NPPF is up for revision next year. In view of the comments and promises of the PM and your own comments, please will you confirm that you'll be delivering a revision which will include a true stronger brownfield first policy? So should we go back to the Minister first for that, please?
Yes, thanks. Let me start with Debbie's point. We are committed, as I said in my remarks, to maximising the potential for brownfield sites, but it is a more complicated set of steps that we need to take in order to make brownfield first, as Debbie puts it, and indeed as Ruth put it, a reality. Because you can't simply say brownfield must come first. You've got to have a planning system that encourages the opportunity for brownfield sites to be identified and brought forward. We know that the planning system, which has many great attributes, also has some demerits as it's become rather more complicated and slow over the 73 years that it's existed. And if we're going to focus on getting brownfield sites, which tend to be more complicated, which often require more remediation further up the queue in terms of preference, then we've got to have a speedier system. We've also got to have more SMEs available with an appetite to develop, because it tends to be SME developers that take the smaller parcels of land in the less desirable places from a developer's point of view to develop out into good quality homes. So we've got to make sure that we've got a mechanism which encourages SMEs as well. We've also got to make sure that we've got good, sensible, targeted remediation strategies, such as the ones I've already outlined. So we will be continuing to focus and amplifying the focus on brownfield. Rob asked the question, and I think others were interested in it as well, about heritage assets, either known or indeed unknown, on brownfield sites. We're very keen to make sure that our heritage is understood and protected. I don't want to say too much more about that now because we're still finalising the details, but it is certainly something which we're keen to focus upon. And I hope, Rob, if you've seen the various roundtables that we've held during the course of our consultation on our white paper last year, we made sure, working with DCMS, that heritage organisations were very intimately engaged in the discussion around how we might approach the preservation of our heritage. That also applies, by the way, to environmental issues. We want to make sure that the system that we land upon is focused not so much upon process, but upon outcome, so it can be speedy, but still achieve the same outcomes, baking in, of course, the requirements of the Environment Act, as it now is, so biodiversity net gain of 10%, the importance of local nature recovery networks, and the like. We'll need to make sure that those issues are properly reflected in the planning system of the future. Patricia asked about Help to Buy and Brownfield. We certainly want to make sure, I think, that we provide opportunities to people to buy homes in the right places. One of the reasons why we've introduced First Homes, which will allow local authorities using developer contributions to develop homes close to where local people live and where they need to work, which will be available to local residents, key workers, for example. And I trust that many of them will be on brownfield sites. We're also introducing, as you'll probably know, Help to Build, an opportunity to allow people to build their own homes. We, in the recent allocation of funds, made some of that funding available to bringing forward brownfield plots for self-build. So through a variety of mechanisms, we want to make sure that people are building their new homes on brownfield sites.
Thank you. Who'd like to go next? And can I ask you please to be as concise as you can, because we've got a lot of very good questions. We'd like to do another round if we can before we have to wrap up.
I'll jump in. So one complicating factor in this question about Help to Buy on brownfield land is the cost of remediating this land in a lot of places, particularly in places like the West Midlands, particularly in a lot of places in the north. We're talking about a legacy, a post-industrial legacy of contaminated land, blighting many so-called left-behind communities across this country. It needs to be cleaned up. If we intend for such land to be used in socially, economically, and environmentally beneficial ways, then we simply need to pay to clean it up without wasting time on competitive bidding or complex incentive structures. Only then is there any realistic prospects, I think, of it being used in the way that greenfield sites have been used in the Help to Buy programme, to provide those aspirational first-time buyer homes for owner occupiers. At the moment, the state that a lot of this land is in, to make it profitable to develop, we're talking about flats rather than houses. We're talking about targeting a much more limited pool of demand for market housing locally. So that's what I say. I think we've got a choice here. Either we can cough up and clean up this land and provide a foundation for levelling up as a project, whatever this land ultimately comes to be used for, or we can think about different tenures. We could think about social housing. We could think about developing brownfield sites as flats and using 10 years of housing that we know work in those particular formulations. But I don't, the Help to Buy has steered investment towards greenfield sites because those are the places that can provide the kinds of homes that Help to Buyers are looking for. I don't think it's realistic that we sort of transfer that demand over to brownfield sites without dealing with those really hard financial barriers of the level of contamination that we've got there. Thinking also about when is brownfield not suitable for development, I'm really pleased that CPRE's report does address this directly. Land that has brownfield land that has environmental value or potential is not supposed to be included in brownfield registers. I definitely think there's scope for tightening those rules up. I'd also point to, on the other side, there are some infamous examples of greenbelt, which takes the form of disused petrol garages in Tottenham. So there's clearly a little bit of leakage in definitions here, and I think tightening that up and giving everybody real confidence that these descriptions are environmentally, socially and economically meaningful would be a very good thing.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you very much. Paul, would you like to give us a quick couple of...
Yeah, thanks very much, Emma. Just to pick up on Rob's question, from CPRE's perspective, yes, we do strongly support the need to have proper assessment of the environmental value of sites before they're developed. And as far as we're concerned, as others have pointed out, we would expect brownfield sites that have high biodiversity or nature value to be sifted out of the process and not considered by local authorities as suitable. Just picking up on the point that the Minister made about speedier system, from CPRE's perspective, the current planning system isn't perfect, but it's important that whatever changes the government are looking at in the light of the white paper consultation, that there's still the opportunity, that there's still cast iron legal guarantees on scrutiny and accountability, so that developers and local authorities are delivering on their promises when they redevelop sites, whether they're greenfield or brownfield. It's also important as well that when a site's allocated in the plan, a local authority has mechanisms to hold developers to their promises as well, and are not going to be railroaded into accepting particular schemes, even when they don't match up to local aspirations. And it's also important as well to make sure that ministers have the scope to call applications in as they do under the current system. Because, for example, if local development orders were used more often, but there isn't currently a provision to call those in. So that's something that we think would need to be addressed if the system was going to be changed in the way that some have been calling for.
Thank you, Paul. Ruth, over to you.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, we all know the reality is that the you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. I mean, volume house builders have been gaming the system because they can get, particularly if they've bought land at agricultural value, and of course, greenfield land is cheaper to develop than brownfield. And as somebody has just said in the chat, develop on brownfield because they can. So there has to be some stronger legislation on this, and certainly a sequential test. I worry about the government's commitment to affordable housing. Chris Pincher replied just now about people getting on the housing ladder as though he meant all people trying to get a home, and use the term people wanting to buy or people will buy, as though that's everybody. And we know that particularly where I am in London and much of the southeast, renting is sadly the only opportunity many people are ever going to have. And we need truly affordable social rent housing. And until the planning system incorporates that meaningfully, and the government addresses how that is to be provided, we're not actually going to address the housing crisis.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to try for another 3 questions. From Emma Atkins from RSPB, could the Minister let us know when to expect a white paper on levelling up and the government's response to the planning white paper? Second question from Caroline Dibden, CPRE Hampshire, would the government level up the VAT rules for brownfield versus greenfield? Third question from Rebecca Pullinger from the Woodland Trust. The report highlights the value of good data to inform planning. However, we do not always have accessible and up-to-date data. For example, the ancient woodland inventory. How can we ensure we have the right data in the right place? And what is the government's plan? What's the plans to invest in data and the skills and resources and then use it? If I could come straight to you, Chris, and prizes for short answers. And if we don't get round everybody, let me just say that we certainly haven't answered all the questions. There will be some follow-up afterwards, but Chris.
I'll answer very, very quickly. Emma asks when the response to the white paper will be released. I think it's right that Michael kicks the tires, so to speak, to understand exactly what our proposed response is and make sure he's comfortable with that. That's why there's a pause on our response at the moment. So it will come in due course, and I trust in due course means as soon as possible. Somebody, I didn't catch the name, asked about VAT equalisation on brownfield versus greenfield. That, of course, is a matter for the Treasury. And as I sometimes joke, even though not all good ideas start in the Treasury, all good ideas can end in the Treasury. If the Treasury doesn't like the good idea, that would be something we would need to persuade the Treasury of. I'm always keen to find allies in my discussions with Her Majesty's Treasury. So thank you for that contribution. And Rebecca, you asked about inventories and digitization. Well, I think that the digitization agenda that we have to support local authorities, cut out a lot of the bump in the present planning system, will help them to build that kind of database that you're speaking about. We put, I think, initially £10 million aside to support local authorities, and a further £60-odd million was made available at the budget SR for support for our planning reforms, of which digitisation forms a part, and certainly the discussions that we've had with DCMS, heritage organisations and the like, making sure that the right inventories and data set are available is something which we see as being very important.
Thank you so much. And with apologies to the other panelists, I'm going to go straight to Paul because we are now almost out of time to round up the panelists, please.
Okay, thanks very much, Emma. I think we've had a really good discussion this morning, and I think that there's been clearly strong interest in the brownfield first approach. That I would certainly agree with what people have said about the need for better data and digitisation. That certainly applies to brownfield registers. It also applies to neighbourhood planning as well. So So certainly on that element, we're keen to see what the government will bring forward on making the system more digital. But at the same time, we still need to make sure that people who don't have ready access to digital technology are not disadvantaged by the reforms. So from our perspective, we would want to see the government strike that balance. We still think there's much more that can be done with brownfield development, as everyone I think here has said, and we'll continue to look more closely at good practice brownfield registers and feed in suggestions to government about how they can be made better or improved. But there clearly is an issue about needing to do more to support brownfield development, and we look forward to working with the government and with others on both the legislation and the review of the National Planning Policy Framework next year.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you to all our speakers, all the panelists. That was terrific. Huge amount of information we've covered, and how exciting it feels, as if there is a real appetite for this. And thank you for all the people who've attended and given us such an interesting bunch of questions. And we will, as I say, get back to everyone with email. And thank you all very, very much indeed.
Thank you. It's been very enjoyable. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone. Really great discussion.